here we are. And I'd like to introduce everyone again to this Zoom series, this podcast series called People of the Land. Of the Land seeks to provide an opportunity for those who have served powerfully according to the calling to share with the world, which is desperate for relationship, their personal stories and experiences of how they have connected with his first chosen people in the land of Israel. Uh, and if anyone needs a Bible reference for that, they might connect and look at Jeremiah 31:1. But in the meantime, I'd love to introduce to you Jonathan, and oh boy, I want to make sure I get the correct pronunciation correct. Is it Feldstein?
Steen,
Steen.
Feldstein.
Okay. There's always that flip there. Jonathan Feldstein, who is the president of the Genesis 123 Foundation. And Jonathan and I were trying to figure out where we first connected. It may have been in person, it might have been strictly online, but we share many of the same connections with people in the land. And he has just been a very great influence for me just following along with his tracking. And so I'm just going to get right to the point here and say, first of all, shalom to Jonathan.
Shalom,
And
Mark.
going to ask you, if you would, please, just to share your story. How did you become involved? What's your connection to the land and the people? And just tell us a little bit about you and the Genesis 123 program.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. It's really a privilege. Always looking forward to and for opportunities to connect people with Israel and build bridges specifically between Jews and Christians. So I'm grateful, really grateful for this opportunity. Um, my background, what's perhaps most unique about my personal connection, other than the fact that I was born into the covenant and at 8 days circumcised as a member of the covenant with as Abraham did with Isaac and as we've been doing for thousands of years. When I certainly would have been aware of that under any circumstances, but I was born in New York to an Israeli father, a man who was born here. What I like to say was an original Palestinian, because back in the day, pre-state, it was only the Jewish people who were referred to by then the British who were occupying the land as the Palestinians. And yeah, so my father, that's a separate conversation. But as a young man, he and his mother went to New York and stayed, and my father completed his education, got married, started his career, ultimately his own business. And sadly, he died 25 years ago, very young. But one of the things from the day of my birth until, well, almost the day of his death, is he had an accent that he could never shake. He always referred to me. He never could pronounce his oldest son's first name. Jonathan, he would call me, because in Hebrew there's no th.
That's right.
And I always had a sense, even though we didn't speak about his childhood here very much, because I think leaving was probably a trauma for him. Um, Always had a sense, in addition to what I referred a minute ago with my Jewishness, to my Israeliness. Uh, Whenever my father would ask me if I had finished my homework, or we lived in a house that had three huge oak trees that you couldn't put your arms around, that old. So for months a year, there were leaves on the ground to be raked, and he was telling me to go rake the leaves or take out the garbage or do whatever I needed to do, or ask me how I was. It was always peppered with his accent, Jonathan, and I was very aware of where he came from and where ultimately I belonged.
Mm.
When we came to Israel for the first time as a just a family trip. Today, I suppose my kids would call it a roots trip, reconnecting with our family's roots. I was a teenager. I felt immediately how at home my father was, despite the fact that he had left and been gone from Israel for probably 30 years. He was able to meet his childhood best friend and reconnect with him. He went to his old apartment building in Haifa and walked and knocked on a door of a woman whose name he recognized. And the door opened, and immediately this older woman opened the door and shrieked his name, how excited she was to see him. And he was very much at home, and I felt at home here as well. But more than that, and I don't know, well, a lot of times we don't know why God does what he does, but I perceived it. I perceived it very strongly.
Mhm.
God put on my heart at that time that Israel was not just home, but it was the place that I belonged, and a better place. Mind you, I was a teenager, about 15 years old. He helped me perceive then, as a 15-year-old, that Israel was a better place to live and raise a family. Don't know, because I surely at 15 years old was not thinking about family, that were my own children. And basically from that point, I always wanted to come back. And about 10 years later, met my wife. We came from different backgrounds, but both as each of us grew into more observant Judaism, we also were aware that this is the place to live. We wanted to be part of writing the pages of our future here in the land and not just watching in the sidelines. And I never even mentioned, don't know if I ever even discussed it with her, but we knew that this is where we want to raise our family. And so we got married 10 years after I was here in Israel, approximately. And gosh, I'm skipping a bunch of years, but at the time we were on the 7-year plan. As she said, we're going to have children. It was important for the children to come here young enough so that their connection and their absorption wouldn't be complicated. Again, God had other plans. When my father died 25 years ago, I took that off the radar entirely, which was interesting, which was me questioning a lot of things. It was very sad when he died, but a few years after that, God put us back on track, and my wife, gently nudged me to come to Israel in the spring of 2004 to look for work. And I said to her, that's a great idea, but I'm only going to move if I find a job. I'm not going to go to Israel. At the time, we had 5 children already. I said, I'm not going to go to Israel and become a new immigrant without a way of taking care of my family. So I came here for about a week. In that week, God was paving the path. Unbelievably, I had a job interview that week. I had another job interview by phone. I had a job interview the week after because there wasn't enough time in the 1 week that I was here in order to schedule that interview. And what I perceived was I didn't need to come here with the job because there was an abundance of opportunity for me. And that's what I needed to hear. And that's what I needed to feel. So I came home. I said to my wife, okay, we'll do it. About a week later, I remember I was living in northern New Jersey. I remember driving in a torrential storm across the George Washington Bridge to my office where I was working at the time, to announce to my boss that I was leaving, that I was moving to Israel. And initially, he chuckled and thought I was joking. And then about 30 seconds later, regained his composure and understood I was sincere, and he wished me well. And that was April, and August 4th, we landed. We had sold our house. We were very lucky. We sold our house almost at the height of the real estate market. So we got our asking price. That helped us obviously financially. We landed here with 5 kids ranging from 3 to 11. And a year later, we had our 6th child born in Jerusalem, which also, when I think about it in connection to the land, my youngest son is named for my great grandfather, who my father's grandfather, who he never met, and a cousin of my father's, both of whom were killed during the Holocaust. My great grandfather obviously was a mature man. My father's cousin, who he also never met, was a little boy, 2, 3 year old child. And what I became, no, actually, right, three or four, because the significance of that is certainly my great grandfather already at his stage of life, but even my father's cousin was old enough at the time that they knew to pray for Israel. They knew to pray for Jerusalem. They knew that Jerusalem was the place to be. And here, all straight through a biological act of the birth of my youngest son, this child was born in the place that they dreamt about and prayed for. And since then, I'll tell you, we have been not without our challenges. Being a new immigrant, I think probably anywhere is never going to be seamless, but neither is life, so that's okay. There are lots and lots of stories I could go into about the challenges and the bumps and crazy things, great and challenging. But I'll say this now, with my children ranging from 16 till 28, not one of them regrets the move. And conversely, each of them thanks us that we have the opportunity, that they have the opportunity to live here and grow up here, because they understand the connection, the very important connection that by being here to the land, to the Jewish people, to our history. And I don't know if they've ever thought of it like I do in terms of writing the pages of our future, but they are. And now we're another generation into it. We've got 2 grandchildren who were born here, and I have to tell you, when I have the presence of mind as I'm speaking, like I'm speaking with you now, to recount it, it gives me chills. It's incredible, because it's, again, not just a geographic move. It's the fulfillment of a dream, and more so, it's the fulfillment of prophecy that we're just part of.
Oh, yes. Thank you. What a beautiful story. And I'm always struck when I ask that simple question. I, I, I don't have to talk a lot after that, but it was beautiful. Um, so you came into the land, claimed Aliyah, I assume, and there you
Yes,
are. So now I'm going to kind of work segue into what and how came about Genesis 1, 2, 3.
great. So while I was still young and living in the States, and before I was married, I don't know if I mentioned, I was born in New York, but I grew up in New Jersey, in a traditional Jewish home, but not especially religiously observant. Now I'm Orthodox. That was a path that I took also from adolescence. I lived in Atlanta. I went to Emory, and I spent several years living in Atlanta. And after college, I was working as the information officer at the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. And I like to joke, but it's really kind of true, that when the diplomats were either too busy or too lazy, they would send me to Alabama and Tennessee and southern Georgia and South Carolina, and places that were, a schlep to go to be speaking about Israel. And I was then in, this is the late 1980s, happened to be during the first Intifada, when Israel was
Hmm.
dealing with a civil crisis among the Palestinian Arabs, but getting beaten up in the media over our response. And I was working, representing, promoting, doing PR essentially for Israel, and sent all over, and it still today, after what, 35 or so years, it's still by far one of the best jobs that I've ever had. And at that point, as a young Jewish man in my early 20s, there was a gentleman one day, one evening, who picked me up at my apartment. His name was Bill Cherry. Always have to use his name, because I'm praying that somewhere along the line I'll be able to find him and reconnect. He certainly has no sense, never had, and if he's still alive, still doesn't have a sense of how important he was to me. He drove me to Cleveland, Tennessee, where I was to speak in a church at my very first Bless Israel event. Now, being from New Jersey, raised in a Jewish environment, we knew that we were different from our neighbors across the street who were Catholic and had lights outside on the tree, November, December time for Christmas, and their holidays were different. But we were never really engaged on any kind of theological basis. We were neighbors and neighborly in all the good ways, but there was never any substance on that level. And I walked into this church and saw something that I'd never seen before. Christians singing Israeli folk songs, dancing
Mm.
in Hebrew, dancing folk Israeli dances, wearing blue and white costumes. And I was supposed to get up and speak and say something meaningful and inspirational, but I was puzzled, Mark. I didn't understand how or why on earth these Christians cared about, much less celebrated Israel. And not literally, but very figuratively, I felt God's very strong finger on my shoulder, tapping me and saying, you're to be a bridge. You need to be a bridge between Jews and Christians. I understood that then, but I didn't understand what it meant. Not at all. And for most of the time that I stayed, this is the late 80s until 2004 when we made Aliyah, I didn't run away from it, but I didn't understand it until I came here. And my second job here in Israel, I was working for an organization that was providing social services, and my boss told me we need to go and connect with Americans who are in Israel. Now, he meant American Jews, and he meant specifically people who give money. And I started this program. This is now 2006. I started this program, which he thought was a great idea, and it was going along famously, and not kind of out of the blue, completely out of the blue, with no plan on my part. I cannot take credit for it. Christians started showing up organically. And for Christians, it was an arguably much more spiritual connection than for most American Jews. And what I realized and made the claim then is that, first of all, this was now God re-engaging me, putting me back on track, that he had tapped me on the shoulder back in the 80s. And it also gave me the awareness that I said to my boss who had hired me, we're missing the boat. We're marketing this organization as a organization that reaches only American Jews, 5 million, 6 million, however many American Jews there are. And I knew intuitively, I said, there are tens of millions, maybe 100 million, depending on who's counting and how you're asking the question, maybe 100 million Christians in America, possibly 1 in 3, who are programmed to have an affinity and love for Israel. And I said, we're missing a third potentially of all of the population of America. And so I said, let me start something. Let me start a program that we can engage Christians, not with language that we speak to Jews, but that will truly embrace Christians. And honestly, I met a lot of resistance. I met resistance starting it, and I met resistance along the way. But God knew, and it was a wild success. God opened doors for me then that I still don't understand. I mean, I'm grateful for, but for me, being the only Orthodox Jew at Billy Graham's 95th birthday, and then a couple of years later to be the only Orthodox Jew ever to speak at the Billy Graham Library, it's not that makes me important. I'm just Jonathan. I'm just a guy doing his job and following God's calling. But it opened these doors for me so that today, now well over a decade later, I've been writing for major Christian websites. I speak in church. Before the pandemic, when I would travel frequently, I would speak in churches and at major Christian conferences,
Hmm.
um, any number of things. And just to kind of fast forward, what I realized after a couple of years doing this is that the boss changed, and they weren't really interested in relationships. They weren't interested in building bridges. They were interested in what I term objectifying Christians as a faith-based ATM, just trying to get money out. And that's not good enough for me. Many people do that. Jews and Christians do that. And I just wrote an article about it that I hope will be published shortly. But it's not good enough. That's not a relationship. That's an ATM. You don't have a relationship with your ATM. You punch in a 4-digit code after swiping your card and take out your cash, and that's really the extent of your interaction. So after praying about it for a very long time, in 2018, with the help of a number of people who understood that we have a responsibility, we as Jews, to be better, to create these relationships and build bridges, and have it not only based on financial blessings. No one should say that that's a bad thing, but that can't be the only thing. So I started the Genesis 1-2-3 Foundation in order to build bridges in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. Not looking to repeat what other people are doing or compete with various programs, but truly to find new areas that had not been tapped until that point. And I'm proud, but I'm grateful that the grace that God has showed me, and the grace that not all the people, but everyone who has shown me the grace over these last 15 years has continued with me, because they see that this is something that's at a higher level. So just real quick, we started in 2018 a program called Run for Zion. Run for Zion is the first Christian-oriented program around the Jerusalem Marathon. I went to the mayor. I said, is it possible that you've never promoted the Jerusalem Marathon to Christians specifically? And he said, yeah, you're right, we haven't. And I said, well, that's a mistake, because if you're a Christian and if you're a runner, Jerusalem is going to be the most significant place that anyone will
Oh,
ever run in the
yes.
whole world. And it can be running and walking, or just the whole marathon experience, being in the city at that time. So we created a great program, and I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of it, but that took off with a very small but very, very significant success in 2019. By 2020, we would have grown by 1,000% had the pandemic not shut us down 10 days before. But what's nice about it is it's an opportunity to be in Israel, connect. You and I were speaking previously about how it's important to connect with the people. So we do that. It's a service trip, so people are involved with the nonprofits. That money that is raised gets dispersed to, so they see and can testify firsthand that what we're doing is real and it's good. And we also, because I love this, the fact, God does not say, bless Israel, I'm the Lord your God. He says, bless Israel, and I'm going to bless you. It means you're going to get something. Even if most of us are not looking for something, he's still doing it. He's promising that. And he doesn't break his promises. So I said, well, let's make our relationship biblical. And if we never required anyone to raise money, but if you do, based on how much you raise, we will offer subsidies. We do offer subsidies that can make the trip even free, which is a pretty significant material blessing. So that was going great, and we're now just getting back on track. Anyone who's interested can go to runforzion.com. But then the pandemic came, and we needed to start doing things virtually. So we started a great program called Verses for Zion to connect Christian kids with Israel biblically at an age-appropriate level, but virtually, because everyone was stuck in April and May of 2020 all around the world. So we just came in with a program that kids could participate in. And then a month or two later, we started the Inspiration from Zion program, which in a sense is a flip side to what you're doing here by connecting people through webinars initially
Mhm.
with people and story people in and stories about Israel that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. So
Right.
that's been going on for now close to a year and a half. That has spun off to an incredible podcast series where, again, I'm the only Orthodox Jew in the room with a weekly podcast about Israel on the Charisma Podcast Network, which is a tremendous privilege. And there's other things. We started a global prayer for Israel, connecting Jews and Christians virtually. And the first of these was extraordinary, really. And I don't say that rhetorically. It was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever done. We had a 13-hour live, nonstop prayer for Israel, beginning in China, in Chinese, including underground churches, praying for Israel. And then we kept moving west to India and Israel and Africa and Europe, and leapt over the Atlantic Ocean and started in English in the Americas, and then Spanish for South America. And we concluded 13 hours later in Alaska and Hawaii, in some of the native languages of Alaska and Hawaii that I didn't even know existed. And this is what I'm doing, just building bridges and making connections. And it's incredible.
No one has ever accused you of being passionate, have they?
I've been called much worse.
Well, you have you've got me excited about the Genesis 123 program, and
Thank you.
I'm not going to drop other names as saying, "Oh, do you know so and so and do you know so and so?" You probably do, but the whole idea is to share this with other people so that we can then start connecting those people, and you and I can do some more connecting. I want to
Yes.
do that. Regrettably, I mean, I have tried to keep these to 30 minutes. So, and we're close to that. But now,
Okay.
the other thing I want to say about that is, doesn't mean we can't do more than 30 minutes.
With pleasure.
We'll just do it in a series. I
Great.
want to ask you though, give everyone a web address or a website or some kind of way
Sure.
of connecting with Genesis 123 so that we get
Great.
that off.
So thank you.
Hmm.
Okay, so Genesis 123 Foundation is available on most social media. Also, Genesis123.co, runforzion.com, and also most social media. And Inspiration from Zion does not have a website. We just have a Gmail address, inspirationfromzion@gmail.com, and Facebook and Instagram, and versusforzion.com is for our kids program. I think that's kind of on one foot, a wide range of ways people can find me.
That's beautiful. What I'm going to do is here in a second, we're going to turn off the camera and we're going to have a quick conversation, but we're going to set up some more of this because I really want to know who we who we both relate to together in the land and outside of the land because it's is so important, so important, and it's been a beautiful experience for us. So and look what we've learned about one another. This is that's
That's
where
correct.
so
This is just this is just one of those supports of the bridge. But you know what? We have this phrase in Hebrew with the Passover Seder. If God had singing God's praise of all the things He did, from liberating us from Egypt to bringing us into the land and everything along the way, we say Dayenu. That would have been enough. And I feel that with you. I feel that if this is my only bridge that I'm building ever, that's enough. I'm doing my job. But how I'm so blessed, as are you, by multiplying this many times.
amen, brother. Oh boy. Okay, now you got me good chilling here. Okay. Well, thank you, Jonathan, and not just for the description of Genesis 1, 2, 3, but for your heart and your sharing of your story. That is as important as anything, just as you said, that would be enough. But there's more, and we'll be talking
Yes,
about that soon. But for the moment, I'm going to tell everyone else thank you for joining us. And I would love to continue this. We will do this. I'll send out a a missive to everyone to, hey, watch this one, and then we'll talk some more about it. But
With
shalom
pleasure.
to everyone else, and we will talk later. If you have any comments or questions or thoughts that you need of me, you can reach me at Mark C. Wrights. That's MARKC, the word rights, at gmail.com. Uh, and obviously, you can see me on my Facebook page and everything else. But the most important thing is to talk about the people and the land. And if you're excited about that, we'll be doing some more trips over there, and when we get to meet Jonathan in person. So,
Yes, God willing.
blessings to all. And hold on, Jonathan. Blessings to all of you.